So, I'll give you a tiny bit of background as to why I am here tonight and where this talk came from. Originally, I was going to be giving this talk back in December at an event that we had at Topp as kind of an open house to sort of get reconnected with the Malma design community. And I, last minute, got stuck by a blizzard at Brussels airport for 24 hours. I do not recommend that, if at all possible, avoid. And James stepped up, who's the CEO of Topp, at the last minute and gave a talk on wicked problems within the UX world. So this evening, he had the exact opposite problem, which was he came down ill, had to take off, and they needed somebody to fill in last minute. So now I'm sort of basically paying his favor back. So this talk is something, it's on a topic that I think about quite a lot, which is the two areas that I kind of straddle in my professional life. Interaction design or UX design and writing and narrative. Most of my job for the past 10 years has been essentially telling stories about the design process and its consequences, especially to audiences that are not necessarily professional designers or familiar with design. What I don't get to do as often is talk about narrative and its consequences to people in the design world. And that's something that I've always found very interesting because I have found in many situations that the tools of narrative, the tools of storytelling, are actually uniquely powerful in the context of UX design. And designers do talk about themselves as storytellers, but don't necessarily know much of this very rich history of storytelling and all the techniques that writers and editors have for telling stories in a compelling way. So this is hopefully the first of many of these that I would like to do, which is kind of talking about some of the parallels between the two and how they can help out. So this is, in broadly speaking, two parts. The first part is just kind of set the stage, which is I'm going to talk about meaning, which how many people here have had a conversation at some point about designing meaningful experiences? Okay, I was going to assume that most of you do. It is probably the most frequently used term that I have ever come across, other than just good UX design, when we talk about what we're trying to achieve. We want an interaction with our product, our service, our app, our piece of software to be meaningful. We want it to have some kind of significance beyond just getting a job done, getting a task done. Which leads to the question of where does it come from? So I started thinking about, okay, well, when I ask people, what was an experience you had that was meaningful? And one person said, well, when I installed a Nest thermostat, and actually when I use it on an ongoing basis, like that felt significant in some way. Every time I used it, it wasn't just that I was setting the temperature, it felt like setting the temperature has suddenly taken on kind of greater significance. Or the first time somebody used Airbnb, they were like, yeah, this feels like a lot more meaningful than just, booking a room at a hotel. Or I had one friend who had been obsessed with his Nike Fuel Band for something like 2.5 years. And he was like, and I've had other fitness trackers, I've used different kinds of digital tools with regard to exercise, but something about this experience, it felt very meaningful. So like, where does that come from? And there's a couple of options that people throw out there. One of them is if something is beautifully designed, if it's visually beautiful, then it is meaningful. But I kind of call BS on that right away. The world is full of beautiful things that are kind of pointless, right? You look at it and you're like, oh, that's pretty. And then you sort of forget about it immediately. There's also this idea that when something is very functional, it has meaning. But again, there are a lot of very functional things in the world that we would never think of as meaningful. We only think of them in the moment that we're actually using them, right? Your microwave oven, it's very functional. It does a good job. We don't like, oh man, me and my microwave, like there's such a connection. For some people, I would guess that status is a source of meaning, right? If you buy a thing that sort of makes you feel superior to the people around you, then there's kind of a meaning associated there. That's not one that I really want to get into because, I mean, yes, it is a kind of meaning. I don't think it's the kind of meaning that we're all after. And another one that gets thrown around a lot is delight. If an interaction is delightful, that brings meaning. And I would say yes, but only for a little while. I often find that interactions that people call delightful cease to become delightful after the 20th or 30th time you interact with them. And that is different from, I think, what we mean when we talk about meaning. So as a writer, you might guess where this is going. I do have a theory about where meaning comes from, and it has to do with memory. And so this is something that I find very fascinating. There's been a ton of research in the last 20 years or so about how memory works. And it's different from, I think, how many of us were raised to believe that memory works. A lot of us grew up thinking that memory was kind of like a filing cabinet, where you have hundreds of thousands of memories, and you go back and you access one, and you sort of go through and you find it, and then you pull it out, and there it is. And you look at it and you're like, oh, that was a good memory. But what they are finding increasingly by comparing the way people's memories change over time, and also by looking at the activity in their brain, it turns out that a lot of what's going on in your brain when you're recalling a memory is the same as what's going on in your brain when you're inventing a story from scratch. Right? Memory is more like making a movie. It's telling a story. Every time we recall a memory, what we're really doing is assembling a story in a way that evokes the same emotion as perhaps the one that we remember having when the thing happened in the first place. So remembering something is a very creative act. But for me, what's so interesting about this is it means that since we're recalling things all day, that means we are in a constant process of telling stories to ourselves and to other people. It is basically, I would say it's the thing that our brains do the most all day, every day, is create stories. And I think this is really crucial. So when we talk about stories, there are lots of different kinds, but there are a lot of stories have certain things in common. And one of them is that most stories depict challenge and then an eventual success or a failure by some central character. And we're going to call that character a hero. Now, every culture in human history has stories like this. Every single one. And the reason why, I would say, is because these kinds of stories are how we experience life. So since this is something that's universal to everyone, it's something that also becomes embedded in our cultures. So one example is, I don't know if you guys have seen Fantasia, the 1940 groundbreaking animated movie. It consisted of, I think, 8 or 9 sort of animated vignettes that were set to different classical music stories. And each of them is beautiful in its own way, but one of them is remembered 100 times more than all of the others put together. And it's that one right there. It's not necessarily the most beautiful one, but it's the one that has a very clear narrative arc. It has a hero who encounters a challenge, who tries to rise and solve that challenge. It leads to a series of increasingly complicated events, and then there's eventually a resolution, and then we get back to a new normal, which is kind of a classic narrative arc that we're going to talk about in a minute. And that's the one that really resonates. All of the others, we watch them, we're like, oh yeah, I remember the Sugar Plum Fairies, they're really cool, but it's not like, they don't have that same grab. So these stories, they're surprisingly consistent. And one of the ways I want to kind of explain this is through a little game, which if you guys will give me 5 minutes, I would love your help here. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to play a little game with you guys called the 7-Part Story. This is a game that, if anybody here has ever done improv comedy, this is an improv comedy game. And here's how it goes. The first person says, once upon a time, and then they finish that sentence, and it can be anything you want. And the second person says, and every day, and then they say something that has to expand on what the first person said. And then the third person says, until one day, and they finish the sentence. And then the next person says, and because of that. The next person says, and because of that. The next person says, and because of that. And the last person says, until finally. So 7 people. So if we can start here, if that's all right. So we're going to go. And if anyone wants to opt out, you are welcome to opt out. Just let me know. But otherwise, it will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Is that all right? Huh? No. 1, you're going to be 4. Okay, you ready? So, once upon a time. Okay. And every day. Okay. until one day, okay, and because of that, and because of that, and because of that, until finally, okay, fair enough. All right, we're gonna try that one more time. Okay, once upon a time, and every day, until one day, ooh, and because of that, and because of that, mm-hmm, okay, and because of that, the cops came, and because of that, until one day, until finally, okay, fair enough. Yeah, that's the end. So, okay, so you start to see there's certain, but and I mean, and these are all sort of like ridiculous, but you might also find yourself like, oh yeah, I recognize this pattern. Like there's a certain familiar rhythm to these kinds of stories. In fact, they're so familiar that they have names. Among writers, the first two bits there, the once upon a time and every day, that's called exposition, which is where you're establishing what the normal was before things changed. The until one day is the incident or the inciting incident. And then the because of that is rising action. And then and then the last because of that, this transition right here is what we would call the climax, which is when you finally resolve the tension that's been established. And then the until finally is the new normal, what we also call the denouement, which is just French for untying. It means like we're getting back to an old normal. So if you were to look at the Sorcerer's Apprentice, once upon a time there was a Sorcerer's Apprentice, and every day he watched this wizard do amazing things while he had to sweep. Until one day the sorcerer left and left his book or his magic hat available, and because of that he put on the hat and enchanted a bunch of brooms, and because of that the brooms started carrying all of the water, and because of that they got out of control, and because you know and because of that and because of that and because of that, and they got out of control until finally the sorcerer came back and returned them to their state, and he went back to sweeping. Right? I mean, that's the whole story basically right there. So this is what it looks like in Star Wars, if you're curious, right? There's exposition, right? I mean, and we're just basically establishing who the characters are, what their daily routine is, right? Hers is like running from the Empire. His is complaining about the fact that he doesn't get to go to Star Academy. And then there's this incident, and this is interesting. If I had more time, I like quizzing people. Where's the incident in Star Wars? The incident is actually when they discover the hologram, because at that moment his path was going on a predictable path, and suddenly it veers off. We got to find her. She sounds like she's in trouble. That's where everything starts to change. And then you have this rising action, right? He goes and meets Ben. He gets the lightsaber. They have to escape. They go on the Millennium Falcon. They go onto the Death Star. And then the climax, right? The run on the Death Star. And then denouement. It's like, hooray, the Death Star is gone. Until next time. And we're all heroes. So there's a few key insights here. One of them is that exposition is really important. And the reason exposition matters is it creates empathy. We have empathy for Luke Skywalker because we get 20 minutes of exposition. It just isn't fair. I was going to go to Tashi Station to pick up some power converters. And it's like, I complained to my parents like that too. So we care. We're invested in what happens to him. On the other hand, Darth Vader, we get zero exposition, right? When we see him, he basically like walks through a door and kills somebody, right? There is no backstory to Darth Vader. Like, why is he so angry? We would probably care more if we knew that. Another one is that Everything that happens afterwards is a direct result of the incident. And you'll notice that a more satisfying story is one where there's a very clear logical progression. Because this happened, then this did, and therefore that, right? Each step makes sense. And another one is that the solution responds directly to the challenge, right? Star Wars is a good example. What's the problem? The Empire is oppressing us. What's the solution? Blow up the Death Star. Is very, very clear, right? And then the last one is that the new normal is different from the old normal. And this is one of the things I find that Sorcerer's Apprentice to be a little unsatisfying, because it just goes back to the way things were, except I guess he's a little bit wiser. So here's my hypothesis. A meaningful user experience is one that makes a good story. More specifically, one that makes me, the user, a hero in a story that I can tell myself about engaging with this experience. So what does that mean? Well, this is one of the crucial things I think that I want to point out here, which is that for designers, how many people here are designers of some sort? Okay, cool. So when I say you're all right with that. So you as designers, you don't get to decide this whole story. This is kind of the downside. This is pretty much set. When somebody is engaging with something that you've designed, their exposition is done already, right? Their everyday, what they do every day, like you don't get to control that. And in fact, a lot of times you don't even get to control the incident. You don't get to control what it was that made them want to engage with the thing that you designed in the first place, right? All you get to deal with is this kind of rising action. I'm facing this challenge and I need to deal with it. How do I deal with it? You get to influence that. You're sort of like Yoda, right? You know, you're there during a portion of the movie to help the hero respond to the challenge. But then at a certain point, you have to step back because the new normal at the end is also not up to you. You don't get to decide what life is like after someone has finished engaging with the thing that you have designed. And this implies a couple of things. So this is where I'm kind of going out on a limb a little bit. These are my own interpretations. So one of them is that exposition actually is really important. You need to know you need to know that the user has had a life before they engaged with the thing that you designed. And ideally, if you possibly can, you should reflect that back to the user a little bit. Right? And there's a lot of ways to do this. You can do it by speaking to them in a tone or in a voice that they recognize. You can do it by reflecting a piece of information back to them. This is one of the reasons so many online experiences have you create an avatar that has your picture or some information about you, and then they show it back. It's like, why are they constantly showing your picture back to you? Because it shows that they know who you are, kind of. It implies that. It's important to understand the incident. What is the reason that the person is engaging with your experience in the first place? Is it this problem that's been around forever and you're providing a new way of solving it? Or is there actually a new challenge that has arisen and you're providing a tool that they're going to use to deal with it? Like, you should know that. You should at least know the difference between the two. One of them is also that whole thing about how the solution should be a direct response to the challenge, right? Empire, blow up the Death Star. That's important when you're doing design work as well. You need to make sure that the solution is actually responding to the challenge, and you need to show that that is important to you as the designer. Right? This is one of the reasons why pop-ups are the worst, is because we have gone to a place, we've gone to a website, we've gone to an app in order to achieve a certain task. We're on it, we expect a certain narrative, and suddenly something comes along and derails it in a different direction. And there's nothing more frustrating than that. And the other one is that, the last one is that make it clear that there is a new normal. When this interaction is over, do what you can to say, things are different now. I mean, this is one of the reasons that Airbnb email that I showed you, they do this every single time. Congratulations, Carl, you're going to Barcelona, exclamation point, right? Life is now different. You have changed the way things are. You are in a new normal now. And emphasizing that makes a huge difference for a lot of people. They've just invested a lot of time and effort into something. It's important to reinforce to them that it was worth their while. So, like, the summary of all of this is that you should know what the story is. And in fact, as a writer, like, one thing that I often find to be useful is to sit down and actually write the story. It doesn't have to be long. It can just be a paragraph or two. But this is a thing that I have done with design teams many times, which is sit down and write from the first person. I am, I'm this person. This is what I do every day until one day. And because of that, and in this story, at a certain point, maybe a third of the way through the story, whatever it is that you are designing shows up in that story. Knowing how that whole arc progresses can actually be extremely powerful for making sure that it fits into the life that you are designing for. But it's important to remember that at the end of the day, you don't get to tell the story. The user tells the story. It is your job to give them the tools to do that. And the thing that you designed is not the hero of the story. The user is the hero of the story. Yoda is not the hero. The lightsaber is not the hero. The X-Wing fighter is not the hero. Luke is the hero. So, specific techniques. This is part 2. And this is things that I have learned about good writing that are sort of like things that I have observed about good UX. So, one writing trick that a lot of writers use, or that we try to use, is to stop trying to be so damn clever. There's this idea, this thing that happens when, especially among less experienced writers, which is you have an idea about something to write, and then you're like, ooh, that one's good, I'm going to save that. And it's like, no, never save it. Always just get it out there. And frequently, the worst thing that you can do is to try and be too clever. If you have something that's really interesting and really worth saying, the best thing that you can do is say it clearly and honestly and directly. And if it becomes a complicated story, it's because you're explaining something that is complicated, not because you're trying to show off how complicated you can be about telling something simple. The parallel to this is, a lot of times good design starts by fixing something, right? We love the idea of innovation, of doing something that no one has ever done before, but generally speaking, innovations that are really innovative didn't start from an intent of being innovative. They started from trying to fix something. And in the process of fixing the thing, the process of just solving, like, why can't this be better? Why can't this be easier? And in the process of doing it, a completely new way of dealing with the system arises. And that frequently, at least in my observation, is a much more likely source of innovation than a bunch of people sitting around and saying, how can we be innovative? So, second one is this idea that we call start in the middle. One of the worst things that you can do when you're writing a story, especially if you're a reporter, is to what we call dump exposition, which is where you spend 3, 4, 5 paragraphs saying, this person does this every day, they have this job, blah, 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 and the thing that at the point of the actual story doesn't even get hinted at until 5 paragraphs in. That's called burying the lead. And what's oftentimes a much better approach is something that we call the inverted pyramid, which just means start with the most important thing first, or something called an anecdotal lead, which is start with something happening, right? Again, Star Wars. What's the very first thing that happens in Star Wars? A gunfight. And what's great about this is, in 2 minutes, you know half of the things that you need to know in order to understand the rest of the movie. You know who the good guys are. You know who the bad guys are. You know why the bad guys are after the good guys. You know who's more powerful. You know who's the smart, crafty princess who was able to hide away while everyone else... You understand a ton of things. You know how evil a person Darth Vader is, et cetera, et cetera. You could have had 2 people having a conversation for 10 minutes where they explain all of these things, but you're generally a lot better off by showing it as quickly as possible. So the analogy here in UX is, get me to something effective as quickly as you possibly can. You don't have to solve the whole problem, but even a very small win right at the beginning is going to do a lot better. And this is one of the things, one of the issues that I have with kind of these very long onboarding processes, where it's like you want to do a thing, and it's like before I show you any useful information, I first need 3 minutes of your time to tell me all of this stuff that you didn't expect you were going to have to say. You're going to have to tell me. Video games in particular are amazing at this, right? I've played like 3 video games in the last 5 years. But one of them is Portal 2, because everyone said it was a masterpiece, and it is a masterpiece. And one of the things that I love about it is something a lot of video games do, which is, if you've ever played it, it doesn't start with like, please read these 20 pages of instructions. It starts with you waking up and a weird robot with a Cockney accent coming and like talking to you and telling you to do things. And so things are happening immediately. And the way that they teach you how to jump versus how to move is he says, okay, now go over and pick that thing up. And you go over there and you hit the wrong button. And he says, nope, that's jumping. And you're like, oh, I guess I should hit the other button. There's this idea here that if you can, rather than explaining things to people, if you can actually get them to do things and explain along the way, it feels much more like you've gone on your way. As long as you're still in the process of explaining something to people, they could still turn around and leave at any moment. And the last one is great articles and great fiction always have a hero that the writer to some degree loves. Right? Even if they're a villain, there has to be some aspect of that villain that you feel. And you can generally tell in a story or in a movie when whoever wrote it or directed it wasn't in love with their character, with their hero. And that's because you write something better, you write something truer when you care how it ends. And the parallel to this in the UX world is falling in love with the user, or being the user as much as possible. This is essentially why we do design research. I mean, it's not the only reason, but it is a big part of the reason. It's to instill in the designer a sense of what it is like to be the person that you're designing for, and to actually have some personal emotional investment in the outcome. So one of the last ones, so this picture is totally random. I threw it up there because it's one of the only ones I have from this summer intensive that I did a couple of years ago in New York. And they had a couple of writers from like the New York Times and the BBC coming up, and they would give us assignments, and we'd run off and we'd write them, and they'd come back and we'd hand them in, and they'd start going through them. And almost every single day, they would start reading through some student's work, and a paragraph in, they would look up and say, "Did you read this aloud?" Because it turns out that this is one of the most universal tricks that designers of almost every type use. If you want your writing to be fluent and understandable and feel like not stilted, go and read it aloud. Read it to somebody else, or just read it to yourself. And that's fine. And there is actually a back room in our offices at Topp where I run most days to read things aloud to myself. And I highly, highly recommend it. And this is because good writing means constantly fooling yourself into thinking like your reader. One of the reasons why bad writing gets bad is because we get so wrapped up into it that we only see it from a writer's perspective, and we don't see it from a reader's perspective. And one of the things that reading aloud does is it tricks us into acting like a reader. And the equivalent to this in the UX world is to try and be naive in a similar sort of way. Try and look at the thing that you're designing from the perspective of the person who's going to use it. Not just as a technical challenge for you, but as something that is going to change the life of whoever's using it, right? Just because it's awesome to you as a technical challenge does not necessarily mean that it's awesome to the person that you're designing it for. Okay, very last one, or wait, is this the last one? I have 2 more, sorry. I'll try and get through them relatively quickly. There is no good writing, only good rewriting. This is why first drafts must be disposable. And this is similar to sketching too. If you know anybody who sketches a lot, like a good sketcher does not really give a crap about anything that they have sketched, because they can always just go and make a new one. And that's kind of crucial for good sketching. You need to constantly be able to throw it away and start a new one. And it's true for good writing as well, right? I mean, anything that you see in print, it's the 20th draft probably, and that's just kind of how it works. So, and similarly, never stop iterating. So whatever it is that you're designing, go into it step one, expecting that there's going to be a dozen more steps at least, right? This is kind of one of these things that we talk about a lot at Topp is you think about something and then you go and do something and then you think about it and then you do it. And after the 10th or 20th or 30th iteration, you might have something that's really worth putting out into the world. So that's all I got. Thanks.